Last Sunday, just a few days ago, we celebrated Palm Sunday, didn't we? And we looked at the dark side of that celebration and how it was after Jesus had entered into Jerusalem riding on the colt of a donkey, waving the palm branches. The religious authorities felt that they had no authority, no choice, except to take matters into their own hands. And so it was at that point that they decided that Jesus must die. And that decision has led us to this point only 5 days later. It was a perfect setup, but it had to be this way. During the day, Jesus was surrounded by crowds of sympathetic people who'd come out. They wanted to hear him preach. People whose lives had been impacted by Jesus. Maybe they'd been healed by him, or maybe his teaching on forgiveness allowed them to see relationships restored. Or maybe even they had been part of the multitude that he had fed by the shores of Galilee. Regardless of how and why, those who gathered around him that day would pose a very major problem for the authorities. So they came to arrest him under the cover of night. 3 of the Gospels simply identify them as a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. And yet John gets even more specific, and he tells us thus: Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now, with blazing torches and lanterns and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. I don't know if they expected Jesus to fight or run, but either way, they came prepared for a fight. But what they didn't prepare for was for Jesus to simply surrender. Then Jesus spoke to the leading priests and the captains of the temple guard and the elders who had come for him. "And am I some dangerous revolutionary," he said, "that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me at the temple? I was there every day. But this is your moment, the time when the power of darkness reigns." And in that moment, Jesus was letting them know that he knew. You see, this was the beginning of the flawed persecution of Jesus. And Jesus knew what they knew, that if they couldn't prove a case against him, then they would have to fabricate a case against him. And it all started with the reality that the arrest was flawed. Historically, we're told that there were 2 problems with the arrest. The first was that it was performed at night. There were all kinds of guidelines and regulations in place for the Jewish legal process, and one of those guidelines was that neither arrests or trials were to be conducted at night. 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, just was under the authority of the Sanhedrin. They were the supreme righteous authority of the time, and they functioned kind of like the Supreme Court. And while Israel may have been under Roman rule, they still considered themselves a theocracy. 2,000 years ago, Israel was a theocracy. Theocracy. From the word kratia, which still meant power, but theos, which meant God. Power and God. And so, in matters of religious and civil law, you had a religious court, the Sanhedrin, comprised of members of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the priesthood. The Grand Sanhedrin had 71 members that was only convened for matters of national security. And then, on top of that, you had a cabinet, if you will, of 23. That was probably a group that conspired against Jesus. And they function much like courts everywhere, under certain restraints. And one of those constraints was that justice would be performed in the daylight hours. And there was a symbolism wrapped up in that, because justice was all about being transparent. And that was about light being shone into the darkness. And that justice should be able to hold up to the scrutiny that would come in the light of day. So here they were, showing up with their torches, seeking him out of dark. The arrest of Jesus happened somewhere between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was wrong. The other issue is that he was arrested on the information of Judas. And under the law of the day, someone who was a criminal associate could not provide evidence needed in an arrest in a capital case because of the conflict of interest. And so, that person then would be just as guilty as the accused. And yet, the story here revolves around the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, one of his closest associates. I mean, when the crowd came to arrest him, Judas steps forward and embraces Jesus and kisses him. And that was done to ensure that in the darkness of the night, no mistake was made as to the right man to be arrested. Because the one thing that those conspired to end Jesus' ministry agreed on was that Jesus must die. But that wasn't the only arrest it wasn't only the arrest that was flawed. No, the trials were flawed. And notice that I said trials, plural, not just trial. What happened after the arrest of Jesus would be considered a travesty by today's legal standards. From his arrest, to his interrogation, to his conviction, to his sentence, things were done differently than we would ever do them today. And so we can't expect that a trial held in an occupied country 2,000 years ago should be held by the same standards as a trial that would be held today in Canada. But we would expect that it would be held at least to the standards of the day and time. From Jesus' first appearance in front of Ananias, you remember that? Ananias. And we see that nobody is really interested in justice. They're interested in ridding themselves of Jesus. In John chapter 18, we read, first they took him to Ananias, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. Ananias had no legal standing in the community, really. He had been, in the past, the high priest. but now he was retired. But he was the father-in-law of the man who was now the high priest, Caiaphas. So why would Jesus have been taken into the home of this man? I mean, suspect that it would go back to what happened earlier in the week when Jesus cleansed the temple courts. And we read that in Mark 11. When they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. And he said to them, "The scriptures declare my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations. But you have turned it into a den of thieves." Here's an interesting little tidbit from history that I came across. The man who was in charge of what happened in the temple courts, the man who profited from the extortion and the money changers and the selling of animals, was none other than Ananias. And so Ananias demanded the names of Jesus' followers and what he had been teaching them. When Jesus didn't give the answers that Ananias is looking for, he had Jesus beaten. And then in turn, Jesus responds to that by saying, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" And so it was at that point that Ananias had Jesus bound like a criminal and sent to his son-in-law, Caiaphas. You remember him. In the Gospel of John, we read, referring to Jesus, Caiaphas told his colleagues, "You don't realize that it's better for you that one man should die for the people than for the whole nations to be destroyed." And 2 days later, we read this account in Matthew 26. At that same time, the leading priests and elders were meeting at the residence of Caiaphas, the high priest, plotting how to capture Jesus secretly and kill him. So the next person that's involved in Jesus' trial has already stated publicly that his intention is to have Jesus killed. I think Caiaphas knew the truth about Jesus, because we read this in Matthew 26. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so that they could put him to death. And even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they couldn't use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward and declared, this man said this, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Excuse me. Understand that under Jewish law, a capital trial could only happen during the daytime. And yet, they were still under the cloak of darkness. And also, criminal cases weren't permitted to be held during religious ceremonies and celebrations, and yet the Passover celebrations had started the day before. The trial was supposed to be held in the meeting place of the Sanhedrin, but instead they were meeting in the home of Caiaphas. And at least 2 witnesses were supposed to be examined separately, and yet here the witnesses were examined together after being coached to twist the words of Christ. Under Jewish law, only a not guilty verdict could be declared the same day as the trial. When the verdict was guilty, at least one night was supposed to go by before sentencing, so that the court would have an opportunity to reflect and consider mercy. But Jesus' trial was finished in a matter of hours. These were the Sanhedrin's own rules, and in their rush to be rid of Jesus, they were prepared to make a mockery of their legal system. And the charges that Caiaphas and his cronies finally settled on was the charge of blasphemy, that Jesus claimed to be God. And so we pick up the story in John 18. Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers couldn't go inside because it would defile them and they wouldn't be allowed to celebrate Passover. So the problem was that blasphemy was a religious charge, and Pilate couldn't have cared less. And so we read in Luke 23, they began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming that he is the Messiah, a king. So the charge was changed from blasphemy to treason. And then when Pilate said that he didn't see any evidence of that, they became insistent. And they said, but he is causing riots by teaching his people wherever he goes, all over Judea and Galilee, Jerusalem. He's causing riots. Riots? Really? Seriously? But it was here that Pilate finally saw it out. He didn't want to execute the carpenter, but he didn't want to alienate the religious leaders. And so he responded. He says, oh, wait a minute. Is he Galilean? Well, then they said, yes, he is. Oh, that's different. So Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas. Because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction. And Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Well, isn't that convenient? That's the old passing the buck kind of trick. Because this was the same Herod who had John the Baptist killed. And it was his father who had tried to kill Jesus when he was a newborn. We're told that when Herod had heard about Jesus and wanted to meet him, and he wanted to see him perform a miracle, like a magician maybe. But we're told that Jesus doesn't even grace Herod with any kind of an answer. And so Herod puts a purple robe on Christ and sends him back to Pilate. A lot of passing around going on that night. And he says, well, I just found this Jesus pretty annoying. So what does Pilate do? He has the religious leaders and the mob demanding to have Jesus executed, but he finds no evidence to support a case against Jesus, and neither can Herod. But Herod's wife had shown up in the middle of everything, telling him he had this dream she had this dream about Jesus and how Pilate should release him. Pilate tells the crowd as a gesture of goodwill because of Passover that, well, he'll release one prisoner. How's that? So he stands Jesus up next to a known murderer by the name of Barabbas and offers the crowd their choice of which one should go free. And the mob, egged on by the authorities, yelled, "Free Barabbas, crucify Jesus." Things are getting out of control here. And so Pilate then has Jesus flogged with a steel-tipped whip. And even then, that doesn't satisfy the bloodlust of the crowd. And finally, in frustration, Pilate turns to the crowd and says, "I'm innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours. The responsibility is yours. So what will you do with this innocent man?"